My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the insistent vibration slicing through the quiet like a knife. Panic clawed at my throat, icy tendrils reaching for my heart. David was on a weekend getaway, a desperate attempt to reignite the spark in our marriage. Yet, here it was, a message on his phone, right next to the untouched mug of coffee I'd made him this morning. I snatched the phone, my hand trembling slightly. The screen displayed a single, unfamiliar number. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a work contact, none of his usual buddies. A wave of nausea washed over me. Before I could convince myself it was nothing, another message popped up. It was short, just 2 words, but they sent the world around me tilting on its axis. Meet me later. Usual spot. My stomach lurched. Usual spot? This wasn't a client, a colleague, this was someone else. The blood drained from my face, leaving me cold and clammy. Who was this? What was going on? Images of him laughing with another woman, holding hands, flashed through my mind. The years of loyalty, the routine of our life together, felt like a flimsy curtain ripped away, revealing a shocking truth I wasn't sure I could handle. My fingers hovered over the screen, the urge to unlock the phone a battle raging within me. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to confront him, to see with my own eyes the betrayal playing out. But another voice, a chilling voice of caution, whispered that ignorance might be the safest option. What if it was nothing? What if I opened a Pandora's box I couldn't close? The phone buzzed again, jolting me back to reality. This time, the message was for me. It was Mark, the new artist across the street, the man I'd been indulging in stolen glances and late-night texts. His message was simple. Thinking of you. My vision blurred, the phone slipping from my grasp as it clattered onto the nightstand. David and Mark, 2 men on opposite ends of my life, both seemingly harboring secrets. In that moment, the carefully constructed world I'd built began to crumble around me, and I was left with a chilling question. Whose betrayal would shatter me first? My stomach churned like a washing machine on high spin. David stood there, his face ashen, the phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. The birthday dinner dishes remained untouched, the flickering candlelight casting grotesque shadows on the wall. Whose phone is this? He rasped out, his voice barely a whisper. My breath hitched in my throat. It was Mark's phone, the one I'd forgotten in my purse, a damning piece of evidence in the wreck of my deception. My mind raced, searching for an escape, an excuse that wouldn't crumble under scrutiny. I stammered, my voice failing me. He flipped the phone open, his thumb hovering over the unlock button. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum solo threatening to burst out of my chest. He glanced at me, his eyes filled with a chilling mix of hurt and betrayal. Password? He demanded, his voice devoid of emotion. My mind went blank. A password? I hadn't even thought about a password. Panic clawed at me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I blurted out the first thing that came to mind, a desperate plea disguised as a joke. Seriously, babe? It's my phone. You checking up on me now? My voice cracked, the forced lightness a dead giveaway. He held my gaze for a beat too long, then, with a slow, deliberate movement, unlocked the phone. The screen lit up, displaying the incriminating messages in all their damning glory. Mark's name blazed at the top, followed by a string of texts that left no room for interpretation. Each sweet nothing, each stolen moment, laid bare for David to see. His face contorted in a mixture of anger and disbelief. The birthday card I'd bought him slipped from his grasp, fluttering to the floor like a dying butterfly. The silence in the room was thick enough to choke on, broken only by the insistent drip 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 of the faucet in the kitchen sink. So this is what, working late, has been about, he finally said, his voice laced with a bitterness that sent shivers down my spine. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over me. The carefully constructed facade I'd built crumbled to dust, leaving me exposed and raw. "Don't bother," he cut me off, his voice flat. He tossed the phone back at me, the clatter echoing in the deafening silence. "Just get out." The weight of his words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, the man I'd shared 10 years of life with, the man I'd betrayed in the worst way possible. But instead of anger or defiance, a wave of crushing loneliness washed over me. In that moment, I understood the true cost of my actions. He wasn't just throwing me out, he was throwing away everything we'd built together. Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. The room seemed to spin, the familiar surroundings morphing into a distorted reflection of my shattered life. With a choked sob, I turned and walked out, leaving a trail of unspoken apologies and a lifetime of regrets hanging heavy in the air. The courthouse doors slammed shut behind me, the echoing bang a punctuation mark on the end of our marriage. David, impeccably dressed and looking 10 years younger, walked out a few steps ahead, his face an emotionless mask. We hadn't spoken a word the entire time, the air thick with unspoken accusations and a suffocating silence. As I stepped out into the bright sunshine, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the familiar street scene morphing into a blurry mess. Leaning against the cold stone wall, I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Suddenly, a voice pierced through the fog of my misery. "There you are." I looked up, squinting against the sunlight. Mark, his face etched with worry, stood a few feet away. Relief flooded through me, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "Mark," I exclaimed, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank God you're here." He rushed to my side, his arm wrapping around my shoulders in what felt like a desperate attempt to hold me up. "I was worried sick," he murmured. "I tried calling you, but your phone kept going straight to voicemail." Shame burned in my cheeks. The phone, David, in his chillingly calm way, had kept it during the settlement. My only link to Mark, the man who'd ignited the fire that had ultimately consumed my life, was gone. "David," I started, the weight of the situation threatening to pull me under. "Don't worry about him." Mark cut me off, his voice hardening. "He's out of the picture now. We can finally be together." A flicker of unease sparked in my gut. Together, the word felt alien, a stark contrast to the harsh reality of my situation. I was jobless, homeless, and utterly alone, except for a man whose motives were suddenly shrouded in suspicion. "Mark," I said hesitantly, "about the money." His smile faltered for a brief moment, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place crossing his eyes. "Money?" He chuckled, the sound hollow and forced. "Honey, we don't need his money. I have a surprise for you. Come on, I'll show you." He grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly tight. My initial relief curdled into a cold dread. The warmth of his touch felt like a shackle, binding me to a future I no longer recognized. As he led me away from the courthouse, the weight of a terrible truth settled upon me. In my blind pursuit of passion, I hadn't just destroyed my marriage, I might have just handed myself over to an even greater danger. The shrill ring of the phone shattered the fragile peace of my tiny apartment. It was like a physical blow, jolting me out of the daydream I'd been clinging to for comfort. I wasn't prepared to answer the call. Every unknown number felt like a potential threat, a reminder of the tangled web I'd woven around myself. But the ringing wouldn't stop, a persistent itch that demanded scratching. Hesitantly, I picked up the phone, my voice barely a whisper. "Hello?" A gruff voice, laced with a hint of amusement, filled my ear. "Is this the ex-Mrs. David Thompson?" My breath hitched. My married name felt like a foreign language on my tongue, a relic from a life that had irrevocably crumbled. "Who is this?" I managed, my voice trembling slightly. "A concerned citizen," the voice chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Let's just say, I know a thing or two about Mr. Mark Johnson's artistic endeavors." Mark Johnson? The name hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of my naivety and the devastating consequences of my choices. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum solo drowning out everything else. What are you talking about? I stammered, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. Oh, honey, the voice drawled, you have no idea. But let's just say, his struggling artist routine might be a tad bit embellished. A cold dread seeped into my bones, chilling me to the core. Embellished? What did that even mean? Before I could pry further, the caller hung up, leaving me with a gnawing sense of unease and a terrifying question. Just how much did I really know about the man I'd thrown my life away for? Panic clawed at my throat. I scrambled for my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I desperately searched for Mark Johnson, artist. The results that populated the screen felt like a punch to the gut. There were no paintings, no exhibits, no artistic accolades. Instead, there were mugshots, news articles, and a string of angry online reviews, all linked to a notorious conman who preyed on lonely women, using their desperation to line his own pockets. The blood drained from my face as the horrifying truth slammed into me. Mark wasn't an artist, he was a predator. And I, blinded by a foolish infatuation, had been his latest victim. Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. The carefully constructed image of a passionate love affair shattered into a million pieces, leaving behind a desolate landscape of regret and despair. David's silent apology, the bouquet of lilies, suddenly felt like a beacon of misplaced kindness compared to the manipulative web I'd entangled myself in. With trembling hands, I dialed the number again, a desperate plea for answers forming in my throat. But this time, the line went straight to voicemail. Mark, the charming artist, the man who'd promised me a passionate escape, had vanished, leaving me alone to face the wreckage of my shattered life. The insistent knock on the door shattered the uneasy silence clinging to my apartment. My heart lurched, a hummingbird trapped in my chest. It was too early for Mark, and the friends who surrounded him lately weren't known for their subtlety. With a deep breath, I cautiously approached the door, peering through the peephole. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't Mark, or any of his dubious associates. Standing on the other side was a woman, her face etched with a mixture of anger and concern. She looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place her. Before I could decide whether to answer, she spoke, her voice laced with barely concealed hostility. Are you, your name? Yes, I managed, my voice barely a whisper. Good, she said, her eyes hardening. I need to talk to you about Mark Johnson. The name sent a jolt of electricity through me. Fear, cold and sharp, clawed at my insides. Who are you? I demanded, my voice gaining strength. The name's Sarah, she spat back. And let's just say, I'm not the first woman Mark has charmed. A wave of nausea washed over me. Another victim? The pieces started to click into place, a horrifying mosaic of Mark's deceit forming in my mind. I fumbled with the lock, the door creaking open a fraction. Look, I don't know what you... I began, but she cut me off. Don't play dumb, she said, her voice low and dangerous. He's a conman, honey. The whole struggling artist act? A lie. The accident? Never happened. He preys on women, uses their loneliness to line his pockets. Her words were a brutal echo of the truth I desperately tried to ignore. Shame burned in my cheeks, a searing brand of my own stupidity. I stammered, searching for a coherent response. He's done this before, Sarah continued, her voice raw with emotion. He uses different names, different stories, but the game's always the same. You're just the latest Mark. The weight of her words crashed down on me, suffocating me with the realization of how badly I'd been played. This wasn't just about a failed affair. It was about a calculated manipulation. A carefully constructed web of lies that had left me emotionally and financially broken. Can you tell me more? I pleaded, a desperate thirst for the truth gnawing at me. Sarah hesitated, then nodded curtly. Come inside, she said, pushing past me into the cramped apartment. As she spoke, detailing Mark's elaborate cons and the trail of broken hearts he'd left in his wake, a cold fury began to simmer within me. It wasn't enough to wallow in self-pity. I needed to expose him, to prevent him from hurting another woman. The night deepened as Sarah shared her story, each revelation chipping away at the last vestiges of my misplaced loyalty. By the time she left, a steely resolve had settled in my gut. Mark Johnson, the charming artist, the man who'd shattered my life, wouldn't get away with this. I would see to that. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, a relentless mosquito refusing to be swatted away. It was the third time I'd called David's number, each unanswered ring a hammer blow to my already fractured heart. Panic, cold and clammy, wrapped its icy tendrils around my throat. This wasn't like him. David was a creature of habit, punctuality bordering on near obsession. We might not have been speaking, but a call, a text, anything would have been normal. The silence on the other end was deafening, a void screaming with unspoken dread. Just as despair threatened to consume me, a knock on the door shattered the tense silence. Relief flooded my system, a surge of adrenaline chasing away the creeping fear. I rushed to the door, flinging it open without hesitation. "Hey, it's Sarah," she said, her voice laced with concern. "I tried calling, but your phone kept going straight to voicemail." "Sarah," I breathed, a flicker of hope igniting in my chest. Maybe she knew what was going on, why David wasn't answering. Come in, come in." She stepped inside, her eyes taking in the meager surroundings. "Look," she began, her voice hesitant. "There's something you need to see." She pulled out her phone, her finger hovering over the screen for a beep too long. A cold dread seeped into my bones, a premonition so strong it felt like a physical blow. "It's about the fire," she said softly. "Fire?" My mind reeled, struggling to catch up. "What fire?" My gaze darted to the screen, where a local news report played. Smoke billowed from a towering apartment building, flames licking at the night sky. My breath hitched as the caption rolled across the bottom of the screen. "Several injured, one fatality reported." And then, the address. It was David's address. The blood drained from my face, the world around me dissolving into a blurry mess. The phone slipped from Sarah's grasp, clattering to the floor with a sickening thud. A choked sob escaped my lips, a primal cry of anguish and terror. David? Gone? It couldn't be true. This was some horrible mistake, a cruel twist in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Sarah grabbed my arm, her touch a lifeline in the storm of emotions threatening to drown me. "We need to go to the hospital," she said, her voice firm but laced with sympathy. The car ride was a blur of flashing lights and choked back tears. Each passing minute felt like an eternity, the weight of the unknown pressing down on me with suffocating force. At the hospital, the sterile silence of the waiting room mocked my growing desperation. Hours crawled by, each tick of the clock an agonizing echo of the time ticking away from the life I might be about to lose. Finally, a doctor emerged, his face etched with a grim solemnity that mirrored the knot of dread twisting in my gut. He spoke, his words a slow, monotonous drone, but all I heard was the confirmation of my worst fear. David hadn't made it. A faulty wire, an electrical fire. A tragic accident. The world tilted on its axis. David, the man I'd betrayed, the man I still cared for in a way I couldn't explain, was gone. The anger, the resentment, all the petty justifications for my actions evaporated, leaving behind a hollow ache and a crushing weight of regret. The funeral was a whirlwind of tear-stained faces and whispered condolences. His wife, not me, stood strong, surrounded by a loving family I'd thrown away for a fleeting infatuation with a conman. Shame, a searing brand, burned on my soul. David was gone, and a part of me, a part one hadn't even realized existed, had died with him. The future stretched before me, a vast unknown, filled with the bitter consequences of my choices. The price of my betrayal had been far steeper than I could have ever imagined. The official envelope landed on the threadbare welcome mat with a dull thud. Dread pooled in my stomach, a cold, familiar feeling that had become my unwelcome companion. Picking it up, I recognized the stark black seal of a lawyer's office. My hands trembled as I tore it open, the crisp legal jargon blurring before my eyes. But the finality of it hit me in the gut like a sucker punch. David's will, everything, and I mean everything, was left to his wife. Not a single token, not a single word of acknowledgement for the 10 years of our shared life. The betrayal stung, a fresh wound layered on top of a festering one. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was the finality of it, the cold, hard confirmation that our relationship, the good and the bad, meant nothing in the end. Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring the legalese into an incomprehensible mess. A sob escaped my lips, a ragged sound that echoed in the empty apartment. This shoebox, once a symbol of my ill-fated independence, now felt more like a cage, a constant reminder of my colossal failure. David was gone, his life cut tragically short, and I was left with nothing but the wreckage of my own choices. The next blow came a few days later, another official-looking envelope arriving with a sickening predictability. Eviction notice. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum solo of impending homelessness. This was rock bottom, the harsh reality of my situation staring me down with a cruel indifference. There was nowhere to go but my sister's. Pride, a tattered ornament from a bygone era, threatened to hold me back, but desperation gnawed at the edges of my resolve. With a deep breath, I dialed her number, the familiar ringtone a lifeline thrown across a vast ocean of uncertainty. Hello? Her voice, brisk and efficient, filled my ear. It's me, I choked out, the words thick with shame. Silence stretched on the other end, a tangible weight pressing down on me. Then, a sigh. Look, she said, her voice devoid of warmth, you can stay here for a while. But don't expect a 5-star welcome. Her words were blunt, a truth bomb exploding in the fragile landscape of my self-pity. I deserved nothing less. The following weeks were a blur of cramped quarters, strained silences, and a relentless job search. My once respected career path felt like a distant dream. I took whatever work I could find, swallowing my pride with every minimum wage paycheck. Each menial task was a tiny penance, a self-inflicted punishment for the havoc I'd wreaked on my own life. One afternoon, while waiting for a crowded bus, a familiar face sent a jolt through me. Mark. But this wasn't the charming artist, the smooth-talking conman I'd fallen for. His eyes were dull, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He didn't see me, lost in his own world of failure. The urge to confront him, to expose him for the fraud he was, evaporated as quickly as it arose. Pity, a cold and unwelcome emotion, replaced the flicker of anger. He was a reflection of my own choices, a cautionary tale playing out in real time. My phone buzzed on the counter, shattering the quiet of the afternoon. Glancing at the screen, my heart lurched, it was David. Panic clawed at my throat. Mark was due home any minute, and the last thing I needed was a text exchange with my ex-lover. With trembling fingers, I silenced the phone, shoving it into my pocket. The silence that followed was deafening. The forgotten laundry sat in a pile beside the dryer, a stark reminder of my neglected domestic duties. Suddenly, the front door swung open. Relief washed over me, strong enough to mask the spike of guilt. Hey, honey, I chirped, forcing a smile. Mark walked in, his face unusually grim. He didn't respond to my greeting, heading straight for the coffee table. His eyes landed on a familiar worn paperback, Moby Dick. My breath hitched. You haven't read that in years, he said, his voice flat. My mind raced. Yeah, just felt like revisiting a classic. The lie tasted like ashes in my mouth. Mark stared at the book for a beat longer than necessary. Then, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled receipt. My stomach lurched. It was a diner receipt, dated from the previous night, a place David and I frequented during our affair. Recognize this? he asked, his voice laced with a dangerous calm. The room began to spin. How did he get the receipt? Did David confess? My mind offered no answers, only a crushing dread. Mark, my voice cracked. I was trapped, cornered like a frightened animal. He slammed the receipt on the table, the sound echoing through the small space. Don't lie to me, Sarah. Tell me everything. Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. Years of deceit and betrayal threatened to spill out, each word a potential avalanche that could bury our marriage forever. My stomach lurched like a fish on a hook. Mark held up a credit card statement, his knuckles white with barely contained fury. It wasn't ours. The name embossed in gold screamed like a siren, David Thompson. What is this? The words came out a strangled whisper. Denial felt useless, a flimsy shield against the storm brewing in his eyes. My mind raced, desperately searching for an escape route. I don't know. I stammered, the lie a bitter pill on my tongue. He slammed the statement on the table, the plastic crackling with the force. Don't play dumb, Sarah. Explain this. Panic clawed at my throat. How? How did he get David's credit card? Did they fight? Did David, in a fit of anger, expose our entire affair? Every scenario led to a dead end, each one worse than the last. Mark, please, it's not what it looks like, I pleaded, desperation creeping into my voice. He leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. Then tell me, what does it look like? Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring the harsh lines of his face. The weight of my betrayal pressed down on me, suffocating. In that moment, confessing the truth seemed like the only way to breathe, even if it meant losing everything. But before the words could form on my lips, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, insistent sound that sliced through the tension-filled room. Relief washed over me, cold and unwelcome. A temporary reprieve, a chance to gather my thoughts, a cruel twist of fate. Who could that be at this hour? Mark muttered, his gaze flickering away from me for the first time. I don't know, I mumbled back, my voice barely above a whisper. With a silent prayer, I moved towards the door, each step heavy with dread. The insistent ringing of the doorbell escalated into a frantic pounding. Mark, his face a mask of suppressed anger, moved past me towards the door. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum solo keeping time with the pounding. Coming, Mark called out, his voice strained. A sliver of hope pierced through the suffocating dread. Maybe it was a neighbor with a misplaced dog, a salesman hawking vacuum cleaners at the worst possible time. Anything, anyone, to delay the inevitable. The door swung open, standing on the porch, bathed in the harsh glow of the porch light, was David. A sickening mix of emotions flooded me, surprise, fear, and a flicker of perverse relief. Mark, David said, his voice laced with confusion. Hi, is Sarah here? Mark didn't answer. He simply stared, his gaze flickering between me and David, a silent accusation hanging heavy in the air. David shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at his car parked across the street. Look, it's kinda late, can I talk to her inside? My breath hitched. David, what are you doing here? The words tumbled out, desperate and laced with a hint of betrayal. Didn't he understand the situation he was walking into? He turned towards me, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Just need to borrow something I left at your place, that's all. His voice held a casualness that felt forced, a performance on a stage about to collapse. Mark let out a humorless scoff. Borrow something, huh? Interesting. He took a menacing step towards David, his voice low and dangerous. Why don't you come in, David? Let's talk about what you borrowed. David's face drained of color. The confident smirk from a moment ago was replaced by a look of dawning horror. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. In that frozen moment, the truth hung in the air, a silent scream about to shatter the fragile piece of our world. The carefully constructed web of lies I'd woven was about to unravel, leaving me tangled in its sticky threads. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the harsh sound ripping through the tense silence that had settled in the living room. David, still frozen in the doorway, cast a nervous glance at the glowing screen. Mark hadn't spoken a word since confronting him, his gaze a stormy sea threatening to unleash a tidal wave of fury. My hand trembled as I reached for the phone, the caller ID a name I didn't recognize. With a quick glance at Mark, I hesitantly pressed answer. "Hello?" I squeaked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, it's the motel manager. You left something important behind after your stay last weekend." Panic clawed at my throat. "Left something?" I stammered, my mind racing to piece together the fragments of the nightmare unfolding around me. "Yes, ma'am. A credit card. We were just about to shred it." The voice trailed off, replaced by a confused pause. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum solo keeping time with the ticking clock of my unraveling world. "A credit card?" I repeated, my voice hollow. "Yes, ma'am. A bank name. Card in the name of Mark, last name." The silence in the living room was deafening. David's nervous fidgeting had ceased, replaced by a statue-like stillness. I could practically feel Mark's gaze burning into my back, a silent accusation that spoke volumes. Yeah." I stammered, desperately searching for an escape route, any route, from the tightening noose of my own deceit. "That must be my husband's card. He probably misplaced it during the trip." A beat of silence followed. Then, the voice on the other end spoke, laced with a hint of suspicion. "We don't normally get lost credit cards back, ma'am. Especially not ones found tucked under a floorboard." The world spun. Floorboard? The stolen credit card. The one I'd lied about losing. The one David supposedly found at the previous motel. The truth, a monstrous beast, clawed its way out of the dark corners of my mind, shattering the fragile illusion I'd so desperately clung to. Mark finally spoke, his voice low and cold. "Floorboard? Huh?" His gaze flickered from me to David, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. David cleared his throat, a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Floorboard? Must be a mistake," he mumbled, his voice barely a croak. The phone pressed against my ear felt like a live wire, transmitting the dawning realization across the connection. "Wait a minute," the motel manager said, his voice sharp. "Isn't this the same card you used to book the room last weekend, ma'am?" The room tilted. My carefully constructed web of lies, already strained to its breaking point, finally snapped. Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. There was nowhere left to run, no more lies to spin. The truth, once a distant threat, loomed large, ready to crush me under its weight. The silence stretched on, broken only by the ragged gasps of my own breath. Tears streamed down my face, blurring the sight of Mark across the room. His face was a mask of fury and betrayal, a storm about to unleash its wrath. David, once poised and confident, stood frozen in the doorway. The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering to the floor with a hollow thud. "So," Mark finally spoke, his voice hoarse with barely contained anger. "The lost credit card, huh? Found under a floorboard, you say?" I couldn't meet his gaze. Shame burned hotter than the tears on my cheeks. Every lie I'd spun, every excuse I'd fabricated, crumbled around me like sandcastles under a tidal wave. "Mark," and my voice cracked, a pathetic whimper lost in the suffocating silence. David finally found his voice, a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "It's a misunderstanding, Mark. We just..." But Mark cut him off, his voice laced with icy contempt. "Don't. You don't get to explain this, David." He took a menacing step towards David, his anger barely contained. This is between me and my wife. And Sarah, he turned to me, his voice dripping with disappointment, you have a lot of explaining to do. A sob escaped my lips. The truth, a monstrous weight I'd carried for weeks, finally spilled out in a torrent of words. I confessed everything, the accidental encounters, the stolen kisses, the weekend getaway fueled by borrowed money and a desperate need for escape. With each word, Mark's face hardened further. The man I loved, the man I'd built a life with, seemed to shrink before my eyes, replaced by a stranger filled with hurt and anger. David, the object of my fleeting infatuation, watched in stunned silence. The confident facade he'd worn had vanished, replaced by a flicker of fear and a dawning realization that he was caught in the crossfire of a marriage on the brink of collapse. As I finished my confession, a heavy silence descended upon the room. The air crackled with tension, thick with the weight of shattered trust and a future hanging precariously in the balance. Mark looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain that cut deeper than any accusation. Why, Sarah? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, a plea for understanding that I couldn't answer. The reasons, a tangled web of neglect, boredom, and a misplaced desire for excitement, seemed hollow and insignificant in the face of the damage I'd inflicted. Tears streamed down my face, blurring my vision. I reached out a hand to him, a desperate attempt for connection, but he flinched back as if from a burning flame. The future stretched before me, an uncertain landscape filled with the wreckage of my own choices. The question of how to rebuild trust, if it was even possible, loomed large, a daunting mountain I had to climb alone, with the weight of my betrayal a heavy burden on my shoulders. My heart lurched like a fish on a hook. An unknown number flashed on my phone screen. An unsettling premonition crawled up my spine, a cold sweat prickling my skin. Hesitantly, I pressed answer. Hello? My voice trembled, barely a whisper. Mrs. Mark, last name. A gruff voice rasped through the receiver. My stomach twisted into a knot. Yes, this is she, I stammered, my voice barely above a squeak. This is John, from the Starry Pine Motel. The name sent a jolt of fear through me. Listen. Ma'am, I gotta come clean about something. Panic clawed at my throat. Clean about what? I forced the words out, each syllable a struggle. He sighed heavily. That credit card you called about a while back? The one under the floorboard? My breath hitched. Yes. Well, turns out the guy who rented the room with that card, he's been here a few times before. Always with different women. The world spun. The air left my lungs, replaced by a crushing emptiness. David, the charming neighbor, the supposed object of my fleeting desire, was a serial cheater? The betrayal cut deeper than Mark's ever could, a sickening realization that shattered the last vestiges of the fantasy I'd built. Are you sure? I croaked, the question a desperate plea for a shred of doubt. Positive, ma'am, recognized your voice from that frantic call. You seemed worried sick about losing the card. His words echoed in my head, each one a hammer blow to the fragile hope that remained. My carefully constructed narrative, the web of lies I'd spun for weeks, lay in ruins. Suddenly, a surge of anger, hot and fierce, replaced the suffocating dread. David, the user, the manipulator, had played me like a fool. But no more. Thank you for calling, Mr. John, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I know what I need to do. I hung up, my gaze hardening with resolve. David's web of deceit had ensnared him too, and I, armed with the truth, was ready to tear it down. With trembling fingers, I dialed Mark's office number. Each ring was an eternity, the silence on the other end a gnawing uncertainty. But I had to try. I had to confess everything. The affair, the stolen money, David's shocking revelation. Finally, his voice filled the receiver, laced with a weary indifference. Hello? Mark, it's me, Sarah, I blurted out, tears stinging my eyes. I need to see you. Now. Silence stretched on the other end, thick with tension. Then, a single word, laced with a flicker of hope, pierced the suffocating silence. Where? The door swung open, revealing Mark's tired but resolute face. The raw pain in his eyes mirrored the gaping ache in my own chest. I didn't waste time with apologies or justifications. I had to tell him everything, the truth laid bare even if it meant losing him forever. Tears streamed down my face as I poured out my confession. I spoke of David's manipulations, his string of women, the cruel truth revealed by the motel owner. My voice cracked as I admitted the depths of my betrayal, the stolen money, the weekend getaway fueled by lies. With each word, Mark's face seemed to harden further. The flicker of hope I'd clung to dwindled with every passing second. When I finished, a heavy silence descended upon the room, thick with the weight of shattered trust. Then, in a voice devoid of emotion, he spoke the words that shattered the last vestiges of my fragile world. Get out. The command hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to plead, to beg for forgiveness, for a chance to rebuild what I'd so carelessly destroyed. But the words died on my lips, choked by the crushing weight of my actions. I stumbled out of the apartment, the world a blurry mess of tears and self-loathing. The once familiar hallway stretched before me, a desolate path leading away from the life I'd known. Back at the empty house, the silence was deafening. The expensive dress I'd bought with stolen money hung limply in the closet, a cruel reminder of my foolish desires. The sparkling necklace on the nightstand mocked me, its empty brilliance a reflection of the hollowness within. David, unsurprisingly, was gone. Calls and texts went unanswered, his promises of a luxurious escape dissolving into the thin air. The man who'd fueled the flames of my discontent had vanished, leaving me with the ashes of a destroyed marriage and a life teetering on the brink of financial ruin. The following weeks were a blur of legal battles and crushing self-realization. Mark, unsurprisingly, received a significant portion of our shared assets. The comfortable life I'd taken for granted was slipping away, replaced by the harsh reality of my own making. Sitting in the cramped, sparsely furnished apartment, a world away from the life I once knew, I stared at the stack of bills threatening to drown me. The weight of the credit card debt, a constant reminder of my foolishness, pressed down on me like a physical burden. Reaching for my phone, I dialed the number to the used car dealership. My once reliable car, a symbol of a life I'd recklessly thrown away, was being sold to help pay off the debt. As the tow truck rumbled away, taking a piece of my past with it, I knew the road to redemption would be long and arduous. But for the first time since my confession, a flicker of determination ignited within me. I had to rebuild my finances, my life, and maybe, someday, even trust. The journey would be hard, but the alternative, drowning in the wreckage of my own choices, was simply unthinkable. The fluorescent lights of the discount grocery store buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the endless rows of canned goods. I pushed the rickety shopping cart, its uneven wheels squeaking in protest with every turn. Humiliation gnawed at me, a constant companion these days. My once manicured fingers, now rough and calloused from unaccustomed labor, gripped the handle. Stocking shelves at minimum wage was a far cry from the leisurely grocery runs I used to take for granted. But then again, so was everything else. A sudden commotion near the dairy aisle drew my attention. A group of teenagers, their faces a mask of bored defiance, were harassing a stock boy. My heart lurched. It wasn't the first time I'd witnessed such cruelty in these aisles. The whispers, the snickers, the way people seemed to shrink away from me. The small town held grudges like trophies, and mine was a doozy. The scene triggered a fresh wave of shame. I recognized the ringleader, a boy from my old neighborhood. Shame burned hotter than the tears that welled up in my eyes. Just a year ago, we'd share jokes and dreams at football games. Now, he wouldn't even look my way. Suddenly, the boy shoved the stock boy, sending a cascade of milk cartons crashing to the floor. A primal surge of anger, long dormant, flared to life within me. Before I could think, I was there, pushing past the gawking crowd. "Hey," I barked, my voice surprisingly strong. "Leave him alone." The teenagers turned, their faces a mixture of surprise and amusement. The ringleader, a smirk twisting his lips, sauntered towards me. "Who are you, his grandma?" he sneered, the others erupting in laughter. "Doesn't matter." I shot back, my voice regaining its strength with each syllable. "Just someone who doesn't tolerate bullies." The laughter died down, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The tension crackled in the air, thick and heavy. For a long moment, we stared each other down. Then, with a muttered curse, the ringleader turned and stalked away, his posse trailing behind him like a pack of dejected wolves. The stockboy, a skinny kid with wide, grateful eyes, looked at me with a mixture of awe and hero worship. "Thanks," he mumbled, scrambling to pick up the fallen cartons. "No problem," I said gruffly, a flicker of warmth spreading through my chest. It wasn't much, but for the first time in a long time, I hadn't cowered. I'd faced down the whispers, the judgment, and maybe, just maybe, taken a small step towards reclaiming a shred of dignity. As I continued with my shopping, a thought struck me. Maybe, just maybe, redemption wasn't as far-fetched as I thought. It wouldn't be easy rebuilding trust with myself and the world around me, but perhaps, like the dented, rusty cart I pushed, I could still be of use. The road ahead remained long and arduous, but for the first time since my fall from grace, I felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark of determination to write a new chapter in my story. The insistent rapping on the door shattered the fragile peace of my tiny apartment. Rain lashed against the windows, a relentless drumbeat echoing the turmoil within me. It was an unwelcome sound, an interruption to the quiet routine that had become my life. Wiping my hands on my dish towel, I approached the door cautiously. Peeking through the peephole, my breath hitched. Standing on the stoop, soaked to the bone, was David. Years had not been kind. His once confident swagger was gone, replaced by a stooped posture and a paunch straining against his two